Hello everyone. I welcome you all to the next lecture session on chiller plants. So today we are going to see what a chiller plant is and how the chiller plant is going to function. So when I say chiller plant, first we should know like where all these chiller plants are used. The first one being pharmaceutical industries, where too many medicines are produced in lumps and lots and they have to be uh, preserved under proper atmospheric conditions. When I say atmospheric conditions, the temperature as well as the moisture content has to be maintained at moderate levels. In other words, at comfortable levels. That is the level which is required for that particular type of medicines. And even when we take food industry, see, food industry is a very wide industry nowadays. You can classify it as the conservation of dairy products, that is milk and milk based products, and otherwise the winery industry or bakery industry. See, when we are going to preserve the milk products, again we have to make sure that no bacteria are formed and the milk packets are capable of preserving at home for 3 days, right? So in such a way the temperature has to be controlled, be it the condensation of the milk or the thick boiling of the milk, whatever process, it has to occur at required temperatures only. The next is in winery industry, where the fermentation of the grape juice has to occur at prescribed temperatures. And then when you consider heavy processing industries where the equipments are running at high temperatures and the space itself has to be cooled. So this is another application of chiller plants. So in all these day-to-day process as well as heavy machineries or light machinery industries, we understand that the space has to be controlled. And when we are using the space to be controlled by water, then you call it as a chiller plant. Okay, that is a chilled fluid, which is water, and that is used to enable the required temperature to be maintained. So now we'll move on to the basic functioning or the principle or working of chiller plant. Before that, I'll just describe what are the major units of the chiller plant and how do you classify a chiller plant. There are two types of chiller plant. One is heat absorption type, that is heat exchanger type. Another one is vapor absorption type. In heat exchanger type, what happens is there will be a coolant fluid. This fluid will be allowed to pass through the space and it will take away the heat and just give it out to the atmosphere, right? So simply passing on the heat from the given space and giving it out to the atmosphere, that is a work which is done by the coolant fluid. This is what is happening in a heat exchanger type of chiller plant. In the second category, that is a vapor absorption type, here you notice that in addition to the coolant fluid, there is one another fluid which is called as a refrigerant fluid. So the heat is passed on from the coolant fluid to the refrigerant fluid, and this refrigerant fluid gets heated up, right? So this is in turn cooled by another chiller fluid. So that chiller fluid is only called as water. Now the water has attained too much of chillness and it has come down to very low temperature, and this temperature is passed on, that is this cool temperature, right? So this water is allowed to act as a processing fluid for various process applications. The process application can be what I told you earlier, right? It can be a space cooling, it can be a room cooling, or it can be in any industry. Even in case of manufacturing industries, the anodizing liquid, right? So that has to be at very low temperature. And suppose a molding industry or a casting industry, the mold has to be cooled down to, it has to be subcooled. In fact, it has to be cooled to very low temperature. So you're using a subcooling liquid. So in any of these applications, this chiller fluid, which is obtained from the refrigerant type, that is a vapor absorption type of chiller plant, it can be used, right? So with this brief outline, let us move on to the in-depth explanation using a schematic diagram of chiller plant. Fine, here we have a schematic diagram of a chiller plant. So this is a chiller plant. Here you can say I have taken the vapor absorption type itself as an example. Here I will describe the major components involved, how they are functioning, and what is the input for each component and what is the output for the other components. That I'm going to tell you. Here you have the four major components. That is the first one, that is evaporator. The next you have compressor. and then you have the condenser, and then you have the expansion valve. So these four components are present in any type of chiller plant, right? Repeating once again, the evaporator, compressor, condenser, and expansion valve. So the refrigerant fluid is going to flow inside this circuit, inside these four units only. Okay. In addition to this refrigerant fluid, we have another fluid that is called as a coolant fluid or the chiller fluid. Okay. So that chiller fluid in this diagram is going to be water, where you can see the blue line, right? So there is a blue circuit here below the evaporator. So this is called as the water flow line, otherwise the chiller fluid. Inside these four components, that is inside this electric chiller, you find only the refrigerant fluid which is flowing. Now, coming to what happens between the refrigerant fluid and the chiller fluid here is, first the refrigerant fluid is allowed to enter the evaporator. Okay. So that will be entering through this dark black line. So through the black line, the refrigerant fluid will be entering. It enters at liquid state only. At low pressure only it enters, low temperature only. When it enters the evaporator, it gets heated up. From where it gets the heat? It gets heated from the water which is flowing in the adjacent tube in the evaporator. Okay, so there will be, you can imagine two tubes which are flowing inside this. So inside, maybe one fluid is here and the other fluid is here. Okay. So in this top fluid, you will have the refrigerant that is flowing, and in the lower tube, you'll be having the water that is flowing. So there will be heat transfer of water from this to this refrigerant fluid. So as a result, what happens is this refrigerant will be converted into vapor state at very low temperature itself, right? And the vapor refrigerant will enter the compressor. So once it enters the compressor, at the entry point, you will understand that this refrigerant vapor is at high temperature, whereas the pressure is not low. I'm sorry, it is not high. Okay, the pressure is low. There is no much variation in the pressure. So this compressor, the major unit of this electric chiller, what it does is it will increase the pressure. That is from low pressure to high pressure. It will convert the vapor of the refrigerant from low pressure to high pressure and then allow it to enter the condenser, right? So while entering the condenser, the refrigerant will be at high pressure, it will be at high temperature, and the phase will be in the vapor phase, right? So once it enters the condenser, here it is allowed to cool. Allowed to cool in the sense it will undergo a change in phase, that is vapor back to liquid. When it has to undergo change from vapor to liquid, what happens is it will lose its heat. So it is losing heat. It here represents the refrigerant fluid. The refrigerant fluid loses the heat and then it comes out in as liquid state itself, right? After it passes through this expansion valve, its pressure as well as temperature is brought down, right? Expansion valve is, you can imagine like this, you have a very big room and you're allowing gas to just enter this room. What happens? The small amount of gas will tend to occupy this entire room. So that is what is expansion process. During this process, you will understand that the temperature as well as the pressure reduces, right? And again, while entry to the evaporator, this will act as a normal refrigerant liquid, which is at low pressure and which is at low temperature. Then the cycle keeps on repeating. So you will understand that the refrigerant fluid, it only enters all these four components and it does not move to the blue color circuit, which is present below the evaporator as well as above the condenser, right? So the passage of refrigerant fluid should be clear by now. Now the next thing is, here you notice that in the condenser, I told the refrigerant is losing the heat and gets converted to liquid state, right? So where it is losing the heat? It is actually losing the heat to a heat exchanger, right? So here you can imagine, again there are two tubes like this. The refrigerant fluid will allow to pass through the lower tube, and this will give away the heat to water, and that water, since it takes away the heat, it becomes a hot water and it goes outside. What happens here, that we'll see later. Okay, so this condenser as well as the evaporator acts as a heat exchanger. The major difference is here the refrigerant takes away the heat from water and gets heated up, whereas here the refrigerant gives away the heat to the water and gets cooled down. That is a major difference. Okay. So now this is the refrigerant operating circuit. Fine. Now we understood that here heat is being constantly taken away from the water to the refrigerant, right? So the water will get cooled. Okay. Now this water is called as the chilled fluid, chiller fluid. Okay. Now this fluid is allowed to pass through the room space or for any other process cooling mechanism, and it is allowed to cool that space. Okay. Process cooling mechanism is manufacturing industry or winery industry or bakery chiller, right? Or it is a food processing chiller for a dairy chiller, anything, right? So this chiller fluid, which is water, it is used to cool the space, right? Now, here you can see another circuit where the chilled water is allowed to pass through. There will be two types of cooling towers. So here there is one cooling tower and here there is an air handling unit, right? So this chilled water will allow to pass through the air handling unit. Suppose you are using this chilled water to cool this space where I'm sitting, then there will be air ducts. Okay. So fresh air will enter from the atmosphere. It will undergo a heat transfer from the chilled water to the fresh air. The air will get cooled and that cooled air will be allowed to pass through the air ducts and occupy this room. So what happens? Ambient air condition is sucked outside and chilled air is being pumped into this. So that is what is happening in the air handling unit. Air handling unit, air changes per hour, all these things we have discussed in our previous lecture, right? So I think this will be clear to you now. Earlier we have seen that in empirical formulas, now we have seen what it is exact functioning, right? The next we have the cooling tower here. So cooling tower is, I told you here water is taking away the heat or it is exchanging the heat from the refrigerant fluid. So water gets heated up and then it is allowed to enter a cooling tower. A cooling tower is a device in which water is cooled to low temperature using induction fan method. Okay, induction fan means a fan will be rotating. It is allowed to suck the air. So as it sucks the air, the water will be falling in the downward direction and air will be moving in the upward direction. So during this transverse movement, what happens? There will be a heat exchange and the air will take the heat and go away. The water will be losing its temperature and come down. Okay. Now it has come as normal cool water, which is again passing through the condenser. Again, it is capable of taking the heat from refrigerant, gets heated up, go here, lose the heat to air and come down. So this is a circuit, secondary circuit, which you can see here. Okay. Now, one major thing that you should understand here is I'm using the word cooling of water, cooling tower. Okay. So when I say cooling, it is nothing like it comes from 18 degrees Celsius and it comes to 4 degrees Celsius. No. The cooling water, the entire plant itself will be cool only. The entire plant is called chiller plant. So its temperature will be cool. So at the maximum, you can expect a temperature drop from 28 degrees Celsius to 24 degrees Celsius only. That is 4 degree. So whatever heat that is attained here, increase in 4 degree means that decrease will be realized here in the condenser. That much heat temperature difference will be lost. Okay. So this is how a chiller plant is. So again, as a quick summary, as we do it, we can calculate the chiller plant into two types. One is the heat exchanger type, and I hope the other one you remember, that is a vapor absorption type. Right? So in the heat exchanger, what you have? You simply have the cooling fluid. Whereas here you have two types. That is the cooling fluid as well as the chiller fluid. Right? And when we look at the applications, the first one, the major one is the food industry. Then you have the pharmaceutical industry. And then you have a production industry. Under production, you have molding. And then also you have casting. You have process industries, etc. Right? So when you look at food industry, it can be dairy milk applications. Then you have winery chillers. You have bakery chillers, right? So these are all the applications. So be it any day-to-day process or any industry, huge industries, you need all this, right? You need a chiller plant. So the major difference between an air conditioning and a chiller plant is you're cooling the air, okay? And there is, in case of a chiller plant, you're cooling the air using chilled water. That's the main difference, right? So I hope this schematic is clear to you. We'll be having a quiz and followed by a small online test based on this explanation. So thank you for watching. Any doubts, please post in the comments. Thank you.